Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am continuing our summer vacation through mystery novels, and this time we are headed to a vague beach community somewhere in New York. It's not entirely clear where Spanish Cape is, but this is The Spanish Cape Mystery, starring Ellery Queen. This is an extremely pulpy novel, perhaps Queen's pulpiest, and that's really saying something. We have gratuitous nudity, psychological terror, as also as a warning here, we have not great depictions of domestic violence. As always, I will give a spoiler free review up until the point of the murderer reveal, in which case I will warn you it's coming, and spoilers will be fair game from that point on. Before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. The Spanish Cape Mystery begins with a little warning to the reader. This is a nationality title, Ellery Queen, so the structure is often a bit weird. We have like that JJ stuff at the beginning, but here we are told immediately that a criminal named Captain Kidd made a terrible and dumb mistake while committing a crime, and that involved David Cummer. We're not told what the mistake was just yet, but only that it happened to David Cummer, and it wasn't supposed to. David is a man in his late 30s. He is single because he had his heart broken a long time ago and has avoided dating ever since. He's also not a big people person, but he does have affection for his niece, Rosa Godfrey, and a little less affection for his own sister, Stella Godfrey. Stella married a wealthy man named Walter, and she tries to entertain, but all of her guests are just like really unpleasant people, most notably John Marco, who is very handsome and he likes women. David asks Rosa about Earl Court, whom she has been seeing, but she's angry because her mother keeps getting in between the two. I should note this is all taking place at Spanish Cape, where Stella and Walter live. It's not clear where exactly Spanish Cape is. I got like major Hamptons slash like Long Island vibes. But anyway, Rosa is coy about her relationship with Earl. We know they are engaged because it said so in the cast of characters at the beginning of the book, though weirdly it never actually gets mentioned in the text. But anyway, David is concerned because Rosa is spending a lot of time with John Marco, but naturally Rosa says not to worry, it's nothing. And then we come to that mistake because a man appears on the beach wielding a gun and kidnaps both David and Rosa. We got a lot of descriptions of this man, but no name. He's very ugly and has like very distinctive features such as an eye patch, and he's very tall. Rosa refers to him as the Giant, so I will too. The Giant forces David and Rosa along the beach and into a car. He forces David to drive into town and tells him not to make any noise. David drives to this secluded cabin belonging to a Mr. Waring, who never uses the cabin because he's in Europe. Along the way, it's clear that the Giant has made a mistake here because he keeps calling David Marco, and he won't listen to either David or Rosa try to correct him. We were told David and John Marco are about the same height and were wearing the same or similar white clothes, so the mistake was easy to understand. At the beach cabin, the Giant knocks David out unconscious and ties Rosa up inside. He also makes a phone call saying the deed is done, but Rosa cannot identify the person on the other end of the phone. The last thing she sees is the Giant stealing a boat and bringing David out to sea. We then cut to young Ellery Queen, who is looking forward to a vacation on the Spanish Cape because he's interested in seeing nudity. Those are the narration's words, not mine. And Ellery is going to get what he wants, but probably not in the way he was hoping for. But anyway, his vacation companion is the elderly retired Judge Macklin, who is renting Mr. Waring's cabin. They are driving the Duesenberg to Spanish Cape when the judge asks Ellery to stop at the local gas station run by Henry Stebbins, not to be confused with Archie Goodwin arch-rival Pearlie Stebbins. Henry Stebbins is older than the judge, and he tells them all about the locals. Many of them are like older residents who complain a lot about the bathers who walk around town in their bathing suits. The horror. You can Google 1930s bathing suits and see some of these outfits. They're not exactly what we would think of as scantily in 2025. Naturally, this intrigues Ellery, who is totally into women's swimsuits, for the fashion, of course. For lack of a better word, Ellery is very horny in this novel. I mentioned this before, that Ellery has like a Casanova side to him, and that really hasn't been present in any of the Queen novels I've reviewed until this one. He's very Archie Goodwin-like here, but Ellery wants to relax because he's recovering from failing to solve a previous murder, which we are told in a footnote is the case of the wounded Tyrolean, which is not a real Ellery Queen story, although someone did write this story in 2012. But while they're at a gas station, the two police cars fly by. Ellery and the judge think nothing of it and continue to Waring's cabin, where they find the abandoned car David was forced into. They can't find the key, so they have to break into the cabin, and they find Rosa Godfrey tied to the chair still. She tells them what happened, and Ellery calls the police. David has not been located, but Earl Court has stolen Walter Godfrey's car and is out looking for Rosa. He does show up at the cabin and mistakes Ellery and the judge for Rosa's captors. After that's cleared up, Ellery wants to know how Earl knew where Rosa was, and he explains that he received an anonymous phone call telling him. He couldn't identify the voice or even the gender of the speaker. Ellery then reveals that he spoke to the police, and it seems possible David could still be alive because the captors realize they must have kidnapped the wrong guy because John Marco has been found murdered on the beach patio back at Spanish Cape just outside the Godfrey house. And that's where we meet some other people. Inspector Moley is in charge, and he is your stereotypical, mystery detective here, and he is a moron. But in terms of police work, he was able to identify the abductor as Captain Kidd because he's so distinctive. But Captain Kidd has now gone missing, and he sold his sloop, that's a sailboat, so it's likely Kidd has run off far away from Spanish Cape. The phone call Kidd made from Waring's cabin could not be traced, but it was placed somewhere local. Ellery meets the Godfreys and their guests, which include Joe and Cecilia Munn and Laura Constable, all of whom are pretty awful to deal with. I mean, Cecilia was an actress, and she married Joe, who's some kind of cowboy. I got the impression he was a gaucho, but that never, explicitly gets mentioned. He is not white, as the narrator makes clear. We have an interracial marriage here depicted in 1935. Laura Constable is a fat woman who is really obnoxious, and these are all rich people Stella Godfrey wants in her social circle. Moley takes Ellery and the judge to view the body still where it was found on the terrace. And if you look at the original book cover, which is the picture I'm using for this section here, you get a visual of how this scene is set up. But John Marco is naked. It's made a big deal in a very odd way. Again, I'm not someone who shies away from unsavory content. I accept the story as how the author wrote it, and even if there is gross and uncomfortable things, that's just the story. I never knock a novel for unsavory content unless it's very bad, but I did want to point this out here. It is very odd the way everyone, including the narration, treats Marco's dead body is gross. It's disrespectful, probably on par, if not worse, than the treatment of Ruby Keene, the victim in The Body in the Library. Jokes are made, comments are made about how handsome Marco is. Even dead, he's an impressive and attractive sight. It's been a long time since I read this book, and I did remember this scene because it's weird, but it was actually a lot weirder than I thought. But anyway, Marco is completely naked except for a black opera cape draped over his shoulders and neck, and this hides the strangulation wound. He was strangled with a wire, and that is the cause of death, but he was knocked unconscious from behind with a bust of Christopher Columbus. Marco was writing a letter to a lawyer named Lucius Penfield, and the letter is unfinished, but Marco mentions something about cleaning up big and not wanting the pot to boil until the timing is right. Ellery immediately suspects the body has been moved, but Moley believes otherwise. This is the position Stella Godfrey found him when she went for her morning swim. She always went for a morning swim with David, as he's the only other swimmer in the family, but since David is still missing, she went alone. But Ellery notes there is evidence. Marco's clothes are nowhere to be found, and although Moley says some pranksters probably stole them when Marco went for a swim, Ellery doesn't buy that. Marco's feet are totally clean, there's no sand, and he couldn't swim. Ellery is of the belief that the murderer took Marco's clothes off of his body and then positioned him back in place where he was found. Why anyone would do this is unknown, but it is the key to solving this puzzle. Ellery also asks about the ties, which he thinks could be important. As they carry out Marco's body, Mrs. Constable is clearly upset and stares at the body. In using the tide table and the lack of footprints, Ellery determines the murderer must have approached Marco from the path leading back to the house and not from the ocean. Judge Macklin knows this lawyer, Lucius Penfield, and he says he's a scumbag, caught up in all kinds of sleazy practices, but he always worms his way out. Molly gathers everyone in the living room at Spanish Cape and begins interrogating them as a group, but he bungles this because he's a complete moron and Ellery has to take control. Ellery is obsessed with John Marco's nudity and believes that's the key to solving the mystery. This is a very common thing in these nationality titles where Ellery will latch onto one thing and that's what solves the crime, but it becomes very clear very quickly that neither the Munns nor Mrs. Constable actually know their hostess Stella Godfrey, nor do they do Walter Godfrey, who stays completely out of his wife's doings, which really begs the question of why do the Munns and Mrs. Constable come to Spanish Cape? Ellery thinks John Marco is involved in that, and that both Mrs. Constable and Mrs. Munn were in love with Marco. But that doesn't get asked, mostly because everyone is extremely tight-lipped in hiding things. They even lie about knowing each other, or at least Mrs. Constable does. The Munns are a little more open about it. The only person who says anything is Tiller, a valet, and he gets fired for it, but he said during the house bridge party that was going on while David and Rosa were being kidnapped, Earl Court suddenly got up and left, and Marco followed him. They got into a huge fight over Rosa, in which Earl threatened Marco after Marco claimed he asked Rosa to marry him. And she practically said yes. She didn't, officially say yes. And Rosa confirms this, as does Earl, who admits he threatened Marco. Tiller is on a roll, as is his tongue, because he cannot keep a secret. As he accompanies Ellery and the judge to Marco's room, he tells him about how someone left a note on his bed that said, "Deliver to Marco," and Marco has since burned that note. Ellery is able to reconstruct the burnt scraps and figures out that the note asked Marco to meet up at the back terrace at 1, and is signed Rosa, but it's pretty clear it didn't come from her because Rosa can't type. Very strangely, this is why Rosa is not considered a suspect. Not the fact that she was tied to a chair the entire evening. Only the idiotic Molly figures that out. Ellery actually examines Rosa's hands to check that she isn't a typist, but Molly just claims that was a ploy to hold hands with her because Ellery's really a jerk in this novel. Also, strangely, this note was basically already reconstructed when Ellery found it, meaning someone else had already read it after it was burnt. But Tiller isn't done blabbing just yet. He also reports that he saw Stella Godfrey enter Marco's room at about midnight. When confronted, Stella initially denies this, but quickly gives that up and admits to having an affair with John Marco, and he was fully dressed when she left him shortly before he went down to the terrace. Ellery actually finds Marco's clothes in the closet. This would be that white outfit, similar to the one David was wearing. However, Tiller also explains that John Marco changed his clothes and put on a gray suit later in the evening, so the police spent all this time not even looking for the correct clothes. We then learn from Joram, the gardener, that Pitts, the maid, has not only quit her post suddenly, she too was arguing with Marco and apparently stole his car and fled. We also learn that a number of other servants quit or just before the murder or soon afterward. Ellery and the judge actually wind up staying at Spanish Cape instead of the cottage, which gives them ample opportunity to eavesdrop. He listens in as Stella confesses her affair to her husband Walter, and Ellery misses the tail end of this conversation because Mrs. Constable sleepwalks in, but basically Stella tells Walter about the affair and blames Walter's lack of affection for it. But Stella has grown repulsed by Marco, and she says he forced himself upon her. That phrase obviously has a different meaning in 2025 than it did in 1935. It's clear from the context that Sheila doesn't mean Marco assaulted her. She means that Marco forced himself into her life. To be fair, I think the other explanation does hold some water based on future events, we'll find out. But it is clear she's talking about him forcing himself into her life. He even demanded that Stella invite Mrs. Constable and the Munns, making it very clear he was having an affair with both of those women. This is even more apparent when Ellery watches Mrs. Munn tear apart Marco's room, looking for something. Mrs. Constable and Stella also tried this and found nothing, and Ellery knows this because he too searched the room before either of them. And all of this is leading up to the obvious here. John Marco is blackmailing these women, but there has to be some kind of blackmail letter or love letter or photograph or something somewhere. Inspector Moley has a contact with a private detective who investigated Marco in the past. Marco would begin consensual affairs with married women and then blackmail them into keeping quiet. From that point forward, the affairs either ended or continued under duress, and you sort of get the impression Stella Godfrey is still having this affair, not necessarily of her own will. Molly seemed to think Marco had an accomplice, and the obvious suspect there would be Lucius Penfield, who does actually show up at one point, and he turns out to be completely useless. He is a character, though. I mean, at one point, he expresses appreciation that he was the last thing Marco thought of before he was killed, and he dabs his eye with a handkerchief, real, dramatically. But Penfield claims to know nothing about anything. Ellery asks him if Marco was a photographer, which sort of comes out of nowhere, but Penfield knows nothing about that either. Ellery and the judge then visit Stebbins at the gas station, but he didn't see anything the night of the murder, which would suggest, but not guarantee, the murderer went into the house after murdering John Marco. Ellery sneaks around and watches the switchboard in the house and monitors it when a phone call comes through asking for Mrs. Constable. Ellery listens in as the caller very brusquely threatens Mrs. Constable. The caller says they have photos of her in bed with John Marco in Atlantic City and holding hands in Central Park. Mrs. Constable panics and absolutely freaks out. She doesn't have the $5,000. That's about $116,000 today. She has no money because John Marco wiped her clean and then broke his promise to return the incriminating evidence. This scene is very well written, I thought. I mean, Mrs. Constable is crying and begging for her life, and she comes across as a very sympathetic character here when she had been portrayed as very unlikable until this moment. But the caller refuses to relent and demands the money. Ellery notes the caller seems to be a bit of an amateur at this blackmailing business. In the meanwhile, Inspector Moley says John Marco's car has been found in the town of Martins, that would be spelled the Dutch way, but Pitts has not been found. Someone also delivered a package full of film reels and photos of Mrs. Constable and John Marco. Ellery is surprised at just how quickly this evidence turned up, and Moley also says it came from someone in Martins. Ellery actually spends the day relaxing on the beach like he wanted to, that is, until Mrs. Constable goes missing. A search is started, and Rosa and Earl find Mrs. Constable laying on the jagged rocks below a cliff, where she probably jumped, and she is dead. The obvious implication here is that she committed suicide. Both Rosa and Earl saw her hanging around the cliffs and being pretty despondent all day, but Ellery, of course, brings up the possibility that she was murdered. And also, Inspector Moley has this idea in his head that Mrs. Constable murdered Marco because he was blackmailing her. And this just plays right into what Ellery, was saying about her apparent suicide being awfully convenient all of a sudden. At first glance, what Moley says does work, but, this is an Ellery Queen novel, so it's not going to cut it. The way Ellery solves the murders by forming a profile of the killer and assembling a list of traits the murderer must possess or actions they must have taken. And Mrs. Constable doesn't fit any of that. First of all, Moley accused Mrs. Constable of paying Captain Kidd to kidnap and then murder Marco, and then doing the deed herself when he failed. But that makes no sense because Moley claimed the motive was that Mrs. Constable didn't have the money to pay up. So where did she get the money to pay Captain Kidd? It doesn't make sense. It also doesn't explain why the corpse was naked. And most importantly to Ellery, Mrs. Constable couldn't have known that Marco and Rosa were having a fling, because the note luring Marco back to the back terrace was signed Rosa, and the murderer must have known about them, and Mrs. Constable was basically a total stranger. Moley isn't giving that idea up, though, but Ellery has moved on. On the way back to the house, Ellery, the judge, and Moley encounter a rather harrowing scene here. This is not a great passage between Mr. Munn and his wife. And, I'm going to talk about this in the criticism section, but, Mr. Munn, in the words of the text, this is what the text says, is slapping his wife around because Mrs. Munn had emptied their bank account to pay John Marco, and her husband found out, both about the blackmail and the affair. And in addition to the depiction of domestic violence in this scene, there are also multiple other things wrong with this, but that's for the criticism section. I don't want to dwell upon this horrid passage anymore. Ellery goes up to Stella Godfrey and reveals that he knows she was being blackmailed. Walter is angry Ellery knows, but calms down when he realizes Ellery wants to help. Ellery wants to catch the blackmailer. He knows Stella is going to receive a call demanding more money in exchange for whatever photos or letters John Marco possessed. Rosa interrupts and tells her mother that she knows about the blackmail because Stella wears her heart in her sleeve and she can't hide her emotions. In fact, everybody knows, including Earl and David. And Rosa was just getting close to John Marcos to see if she could stop him. She had no intentions of marrying him. And just before the phone call arrives, the afternoon newspaper is published, and the front story is Mrs. Munn's affair with John Marco. The Munns didn't pay up, and this was their punishment. Stella receives the call and agrees to pay the $25,000 blackmail, which she has in bonds, and is told to drop it off at the local post office. Ellery stakes out the post office with Tiller and nabs the blackmailer, who is wearing a black mustache. And it turns out the blackmailer is Pitts, the maid who stole the car. I don't think this really comes as much as a surprise to anyone. The cousins don't really try to hide it much. And Pitts is pretty open as well because she doesn't want to get arrested for murder. But basically, Pitts and John Marco work together. He would seduce rich women, sleep with them, and then blackmail them. Pitts would take the incriminating photos. Oh, and they weren't just accomplices. They were actually married. But Pitts admits to becoming angry with John Marco because what started out purely as business started to become personal. He started enjoying the affairs. And on the night he was murdered, Pitts went up to Marco's room to speak with him, but he wasn't there. She is the one who reassembled the burnt letter and noticed that it was signed Rosa. This angered Pitts because Rosa was not a blackmail target, so she assumed Marco was sleeping around with Rosa for pleasure. She went down to the terrace but found John Marco dead already, and he was completely naked. He didn't even have the cape on him. Pitts panicked when she heard the gardener coming, so she quickly put the hat on John Marco, put the cane in his hand, and wrapped the cape around him so it would appear to passers-by that he was alive when she escaped. Pitts says she went back to Marco's room, grabbed the letters, and then left in the car. And she rather humorously notes she can't be brought up on auto theft charges because, as Marco's wife, the car is now hers. But she swears she didn't kill him, and Ellery believes her. Inspector Moley does not, but, we don't care what he thinks. Ellery asks Pitts about the cape. Where was the cape when she found Marco? And she says the cape wasn't there at all. She actually brought the cape with her because she found it in his room, and that was her excuse if someone saw her in John Marco's room, that she was just going to bring him his cape. And that was the excuse. And that is the final clue Ellery needs. And it's where the reader receives the classic challenge to the reader, informing us we are now in possession of all the evidence needed to solve this crime. And it's where I end the spoiler-free section, so back out now if you don't want to be spoiled. You've been warned. I know it doesn't appear like we have any clues at all to help us, but we actually do with some creative thinking. And to be honest, this is probably one of the easier nationality titles to solve, believe it or not. As a storm brews, Ellery assembles everyone in the living room and explains, as he usually does, how easy the case is when, of course, naturally it's not. But as Ellery explains, the most important clue was John Marco's nakedness, and goes through 5 possible reasons for it. He rejects the first 4, but just as he gets to the 5th and final reason, a detective barges in and says they found Waring's boat at sea. You'll remember Captain Kidd stole that boat at the beginning of the novel. So everyone rushes out in the middle of the storm, and we're told the judge was the only one sensible enough to put on a raincoat. But the storm is raging and the waves are rough, but they spot a man trying to swim ashore. It's David Cummer. He is alive, and they help him ashore, where Ellery declares that David Cummer is under arrest for the murder of John Marco. The rest is explained by Ellery as he drives the judge back to New York City in the Duesenberg. The judge asks Ellery what the 5th reason for the nudity was. As Ellery explains, the answer is quite simple. Why would someone take the clothes off of John Marco? Or perhaps that's not the right question. Why would someone take the clothes off of a dead body? Or more generally, why do people steal clothes? What do people do with clothes? They wear them. Why would the murderer wear John Marco's clothes? Because the murderer wasn't wearing any clothes when he committed the murder. This is what happened. When David was kidnapped at the beginning of the novel by Captain Kidd, that was all fake. David hired Captain Kidd to capture him, which would give him an alibi. David used Rosa as confirmation that Kidd was really after John Marco. But he wasn't. He was after David the whole time. After tying up Rosa, Kidd took David out to sea on Waring's stolen boat. Then, during the night, David took off all of his clothes, swam to Spanish Cape. It was a long swim, and David couldn't be burdened down by wearing his own clothes during the swim. After arriving on shore, David hid behind a large decorative pot and waited. But Marco was late, and he didn't show up until 1 o'clock, when he was supposed to arrive at 12. The letter had been burned. After the letter had been burned, Ellery only read at 1 o'clock, but it really said 12 o'clock. But Marco dillied with Stella and was late. After knocking Marco out and strangling him, Ellery notes the wire used to strangle him would not have burdened David down during a swim. David's original plan was to leave the terrace by way he came, from the sea. However, the tide had receded by then, so David would have left footprints in the sand. So he was forced to leave via the path near the house, and to do that, he needed clothes. He couldn't walk around town naked. So he stole Marco's clothes to make his escape. Why did he do this? Well, as Rosa had already said, David knew Marco was blackmailing his sister Stella and believed he was also blackmailing Rosa, and decided it had to stop. Ellery is initially confused by the lack of footprints seemed to indicate the murderer would have came and left by the path toward the house. But once he realized the letter setup had a meeting time of 12, not 1, he realized that any footprints coming ashore would have been washed away by the tide. That basically eliminated anyone staying at the house. Ellery was also confused by the cloak, because a cloak is so much easier to wear to cover oneself than stealing a dead man's clothes. Remember, there is an ordinance allowing bathers in swimsuits to walk through town, so the murderer did not need to be fully dressed. The cloak would suffice, and once Ellery learned that Marco was not wearing the cloak when he was murdered, it all fell into place. There were 6 characteristics that Ellery said the murderer had to have, and David was the only person to fit them all. 1. The murderer had to have known about Marco's relationships. 2. The murderer had to know Stella Godfrey took an early morning swim. This was crucial because the murderer avoided leaving footprints leaving the beach because they would not have been washed away by the time Stella went for her early morning swim. 3. The murderer knew the tide schedule. 4. The murderer was a good swimmer. 5. The murderer had to be the same size as Marco in order to wear his clothes. And 6. The criminal had to have access to the typewriter in the Godfrey house. Since the murderer did not come directly from the Godfrey house, that eliminated everyone but David, Rosa, and Captain Kidd. And while Rosa could have theoretically worn Marco's clothes, the hat was not stolen, and she would have needed the hat to disguise herself because she's a woman, and she would be noticed as a woman in man's clothes. Also, she was tied up all night. She also couldn't swim or type. Captain Kidd was way too big for the clothes, so that only left David. So David took Marco's clothes to wear as he made his escape by land because by sea was no longer an option because the tide had receded. Ellery and the judge discussed the complications of this case. They agree John Marco is someone worthy of being murdered, but the way David committed the crime means he will likely be found guilty. Had he just stabbed Marco in rage or something, Ellery suspects the jury would never have convicted him. But because he went through this whole rigmarole of being kidnapped and all that, it became a much more precarious situation for David. And to clear some loose ends up, Mrs. Constable did commit suicide. Rosa and Earl are engaged. Captain Kidd's whereabouts are still unknown, but it's speculated David probably paid him to just go away to parts unknown, and Ellery suspects the captain does not actually know about the murder of John Marco. Let's get into praise. This is such an odd book because I don't have a lot of specific pieces of praise for it. It's an overall solid novel. I think it's a pretty good novel. This is the last of the true nationality titles. I mean, technically Halfway House is, but they dumped the naming motif. But the nationality titles are far more like puzzle-based and character-based. But I would say this book sort of transitions between the two. The puzzle is good and it is solvable. I think this is probably one of the more solvable nationality titles because the puzzle isn't so difficult compared to the others. And there is some character work here. Mrs. Constable is a fantastic character who has a very short story arc, but one executed brilliantly. We initially hate her, but then we find out she has an incredibly sympathetic backstory of having a dying husband and her adult children being successful and her not wanting to ruin that for them. Her panic and fear is palpable on the page, and I appreciate the light writing in this novel. As I already said, this is a bit of easing into the more character-based novels moving forward. This one is not burdened down by complicated vocabulary or an overly complex plot. There is a bit of humor here, and while this humor didn't age particularly well, I do think there are moments that are genuinely funny. There's also quite a bit of self-awareness from the cousins where if you know who they are in their lives, you'll notice some self-deprecating inside jokes. there is something to appreciate in like the pulpiness of this novel. It's not to be taken seriously, but still provides for readers a good story. I've always thought that about farces. Not that this book is a farce, but just because something is funny, it doesn't mean it deserves a silly plot. Again, overall, I don't think I have a lot of specific praise for Spanish Cape Mystery. It's a solid novel. It does its job. I don't think it's one of the cousins' best, but again, still pretty good. And as for criticism, there's a lot to discuss here. I don't want to, the bevy of criticisms here to give the impression this book is terrible. This is a decent novel, but it is one that is flawed. Let's get the most unpleasant issue out of the way first. Spanish Cape Mystery contains a lot of unsavory content, and I never let unsavory content affect my overall opinion of the novel because I think books need to feel like the year in which they are set. People use different language and had different thought systems at different times in history. I don't think it's appropriate to assess a 90-year-old novel by 2025 standards. I really only let this content affect my opinion when it's very bad or inappropriate, even in its time. And this novel has a passage depicting domestic abuse, and I don't deduct from this novel for that scene. If the author of the novel thinks a scene like that is appropriate for the novel, then so be it. However, this scene is truly horrendous for multiple reasons. Ellery makes multiple jokes about it, including saying that is how one treats a wife. There is a direct connection made between Mr. Munn's Hispanic ethnicity and him abusing his wife. We're told multiple times his race makes him do these things, as well as other things. We're told he looks like a criminal. We have three men witnessing this scene, and none of them think to do anything to help Mrs. Munn at all, and she continues to be ridiculed for the rest of the novel. We're told repeatedly that Mr. Munn looks like he's a criminal because he's from Argentina and they're all criminals there. Very similar with John Marco, whose race is unknown but is sort of hinted to be Hispanic. We have, even beyond that, we have sexualization of a corpse, including multiple comments from Ellery about how handsome the body is and how the women will get a kick out of seeing it. It's meant to be funny, but it's gross, and I would imagine this was not funny in 1935. Moving on to more novel-specific things, this book does not play fair. The first chapter is a lie. We're told Captain Kidd made a mistake in kidnapping John Marco. That is the narration's words, but it turns out that wasn't a mistake. David was the target the entire time. So the opening chapter is misleading. I wouldn't say making David the murderer violates the rules of detective fiction. He is someone introduced early on and whom the reader knows, but he is absent for like the middle 85% of the book, if not more. So I think it does violate the spirit of the rules, not the literally. I did feel at certain times things were sort of extra. They were there just to be there. I think the nudity of the corpse is a good example. I don't know why David had to take all of Marco's clothes. He could have just taken the pants. We're told repeatedly bathers can walk through town, so he doesn't need a shirt. And we're told that male swimmers don't wear tops when swimming. Ellery was explicitly stated to be bare-chested while swimming. This isn't Victorian England. The nudity seemed to be there just to be sensational. At one point, Ellery lists 5 possible reasons Marco could have been naked, and 2 of them are basically the same. A third doesn't make sense, and he also ignored 2 previous reasons he brought up earlier in the novel for this, and quite frankly, those reasons were more compelling, so it's a bit of an error. It's not really a knock, but I don't know why Ellery's companion here is the judge and not his father. I don't know what Judge Macklin brought that Inspector Queen couldn't. I just think overall the plot sort of falls short of expectations for a Queen novel, which are usually either more creative or simply have a more engaging plot. And I think something to note here is we do have an adaptation of this novel. This, I believe, was the very first Queen screen adaptation, and it also came out in 1935, just a few months after the book was published. This was a very common thing done here. Philo Vance novels were like this, and at one point, like S.S. Van Dyne just basically stopped writing novels and just wrote what he wanted in the movie in book form. And this adaptation is terrible. I do not recommend. And I think, though, that is something to consider is that the cousins wrote this novel knowing there would be a film made at the same time. So I think the novel is written in a way to be adaptable for the screen rather than as a novel. I think that is something to take in consideration today. And I think this is also something, an issue we see much more common today. Like, I think authors today sort of expect their books to be adapted. So, and because we're so much more influenced by TV and film, I do notice a lot more authors today are sort of writing in a way I think is better for the screen than in a novel form. It's a very odd thing to have happened in 1935, but I think that is a possible explanation for some of this book's issues, though certainly not all of them. Moving on to characters, starting with Ellery, and this is definitely a weird one for Ellery. I think he has good moments, but this novel isn't as heavy in deduction, so there isn't a lot of like Ellery thinking about things. Instead, we see him being more of like a man of action, snooping around, eavesdropping, that sort of thing. And he is still that like slight jerk of an Ellery Queen we all know and love as a character. He does also though have not great moments, as I've already mentioned. You know, he doesn't do anything to help Mrs. Munn, implying that sort of like she got what she deserved for her abuse and the blackmail. Also, Ellery is very horny in this novel. He was definitely channeling that like horny dog bonk meme, that, you know, that one. I'm sure you've seen it online. And that is definitely like quote unquote normal behavior for a single adult male. It felt overwhelming at times. It goes like sort of like beyond like normal like checking out women at the beach type of thing. Everything is sexual to him. At one point, he speculates Marco is naked because a woman murdered him just to see him naked. It's very strange. And he's constantly talking about how handsome John Marco is and describes his body a lot. There's a somewhat popular conspiracy theory out there that Ellery is gay. To be honest, that's really just the tip of the iceberg. This theory gets very weird very, very quickly. You do not want to go down that rabbit hole. But this novel is definitely, I guess, evidence in that direction. I mean, at one point, Ellery dreams of John Marco dancing in tights. I mean, lots going on in Ellery's head here, but overall, I do think it was like fine here. There were some not so great moments, but also some great ones as well. Our murderer is David Cummer, and not a lot to say here. For someone who only appeared in one chapter at the beginning and wasn't really talked about much afterward, I did feel as if we learned enough about him. I know he's a bit shy, we doesn't like people, doesn't like crowds. I thought there was some great cluing pointing to him, you know, like Stella casually mentioning he's a strong swimmer and Rosa mentioning David knew about the blackmail. I do think there are inconsistencies in his character. I think someone who was shy and hates people isn't exactly the kind of person who would commit a murder, and certainly also not the kind of person who would commit a murder while naked, but, you know, whatever. He was desperate. Not a lot to say here. I do think he was a satisfying murderer. I did not feel cheated. David Cummer was the murderer, even though he wasn't really in the book that much. Again, could it have been better? Yes, but I think it was fine overall. Our victim, John Marco, one of the jerk victims we've become accustomed to in detective fiction. He is one of these characters we're immediately primed to hate without giving us a reason. We're told to hate him right away, but unlike many other characters in that category, we are provided the content to hate him. The text does back it up eventually. It doesn't rely solely on like the narration to tell us to hate him. The blackmailing scheme is terrible. He's a jerk. He manipulates women into sleeping with him. The story backs it up. Now, there is some unsavoriness, again, regarding his race. He's sort of like vaguely Hispanic, and there is a link made between that and his unsavory personality that's not particularly great. Overall, I do find there are much better like jerk victims in other Queen novels and other mystery novels overall. Moving on to regular characters, Judge Macklin. I do not know why Judge Macklin is in this novel over Inspector Queen. I don't know what he brought that Inspector Queen wouldn't bring and bring better. Again, he wasn't a bad character by any means, but he didn't really do anything. He didn't contribute much to the group. Ellery kept calling him Solon, who was an ancient Greek philosopher known to be a fair man who overruled a lot of the draconian laws, literally draconian laws of the day. And I didn't really see Judge Macklin as like super wise here. In fact, he seemed to be most out of the loop in the way like Ellery would keep his father out of the loop, so it was a bit of an odd choice. And we have Inspector Moley, who was a complete dunce. He actually did have some moments of brilliance. He's the only person who thinks Rose is innocent because she was tied up all night. And as much of an idiot as he was, I think might have been misplaced. He is a bit representative of common sense, whereas Ellery and the judge are thinking in terms of like 4D, 5D chess, a level Moley could never reach. Moley also isn't blinded by such complex thinking and notices the obvious in a way Ellery overthinks. I always think it's funny to have like the generic inspector be a bit dumb, but in this case, it did seem like a little insulting to the readers, who I believe are probably thinking along the same lines as Moley is. We have Stella Godfrey, who I thought was a fine character. I wish we saw more of her, the hostess with mysterious intentions, and we really didn't get to see a lot of that played out. I did find her backstory of blackmail victim to be a little generic. It actually runs very similarly, not only to other characters in other mystery novels, but to other characters in this novel. I didn't feel we saw enough of her, but I did feel as if we got to know who she is, a social climber who will do anything to be locally famous. I just wish that was dwelled upon more. And sort of the same thing with her husband Walter, a little generic, but I don't think generic is necessarily bad because it works for the story. The aloof husband who doesn't really care what his wife is doing, he just doesn't want to be bothered. You get the sense when he finds out his wife's affair and the blackmail that he doesn't really care all that much about it. He's just upset he has to do something about it. He doesn't seem to care at all his wife was having an affair. He would also get like very indignant at Ellery at times, only for him to back down very easily and quickly. A bit of a comedic figure, but not one overly so. Rosa Godfrey is a character type we see a lot of in Early Queen, the young, pretty damsel in distress who needs a man to come and save her. First Uncle David, then Earl Court, then Ellery. This is a character you see a lot of in pulp novels. Rosa even admits at one point that she doesn't know how to do anything, which definitely appears to be true. I mean, she does nothing constructive throughout the novel. A little generic, but again, that's not necessarily a bad thing in a novel not focused on character. Mrs. Constable, to me, was a standout character. She has this tragic backstory of her dying husband, and she can't go for him for money because she just wouldn't do that to him, and she doesn't want to ruin the lives of her adult children either, so she, in the face of blackmail, commits suicide. And I did find this to be a moving storyline, definitely the only one of its kind in the novel, and I liked how the cousins made us hate her initially, then sort of pulled the wool over our eyes. I do wish she wasn't like constantly described as fat. Her weight is brought up quite a bit, always unpleasant. It's sort of nonsensical and just seems like mean spirited just to be mean, but nonetheless, I thought she was the best character in the book. And finally, we have the Muns, who, as I already explained, are very problematic. I've said all I want to about them already. I don't want to dwell. They could have been great characters. They had a potentially interesting dynamic, and it's a shame it just didn't go that way. Again, I don't want to dwell on how problematic they were, so just moving on. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Spanish Cape Mystery. I will say, I do think this is a novel that's better than the sum of its parts. I did find when I was assessing the different aspects of this novel, none of them really stood out. And nonetheless, I thought the product was better. So I think the actual novel is definitely much better than I probably made it seem here in my assessment. But anyway, next week I do have a viewer requested video from a long time ago that I'm finally getting around to. I will rank all of Agatha Christie's plays. Now, this will be a little bit of a weird one because plays are meant to be performed, but these are mostly going to be judged on, the written sort of novelized version, or sometimes we have like published manuscripts. So it's going to be a little bit different, a little bit strange, and a little bit odd, but then again, that's this channel. So until next time, Mystery Files.